1996, when we first formed the S.E.E. is not on right now. With me right now is Mark Zapotowski, the executive producer of the program. He's going to talk about his experiences in the public schools, and later in the program we'll be joined by Jack Prince, who's the co-host of the radio program Southpaws, who's been in public education for 20 years and has authored a series of articles in the local magazine Grid concerning the effects of Betsy DeVos's systematic attacks on public education over the last 20 years. 20 years we've been talking about Betsy DeVos and public education, and you've seen some of the effects from the inside. Mark Zapotowski.
Well, we have quite an echo going on in here, a little bit of a technical matter, but yeah, I don't know that Betsy DeVos specifically affected my situation, but I know that she's not a friend of the public schools, and I know that she comes from a background, you know, her family and the Prince family and the DeVos family that they're allied with, obviously, they don't believe in the public owning anything. That's something that philosophically they're deeply opposed to. And this has led to a denigration of the idea of the public schools, and so they're always perhaps eager to see them fail. And so this is always a question when you're talking about Betsy DeVos. Is it that she wants to fix the public schools, or does she want to dismantle them because of this deeply held, you know, long-held family belief that nothing should be owned by the public?
It seems quite clear that dismantling the school is the intention.
Privatization.
Privatization, but also the stratification of society, maintaining the stratification of society by making the public schools the repositories of the unteachable, and then not supporting them enough to even save those who could be saved.
Well, I would say that the constant pressure to test made the schools very unattractive to the students themselves. And if you're constantly teaching for the test, it's one way to make the schools more likely to fail.
And this is also
It becomes essentially contentless, really, and more vile to the students themselves. Your actual guest?
Yeah.
Intended guest is here, so with that brief moment.
It's my fault. I thought that the show was starting at 8 o'clock. But if you could join us, Jack, it'd be great to get this conversation started. Joining me now is Jack Prince. I'm a political activist, co-host of the radio program Southpaws, and a 30-year veteran of the public schools, the author of some articles concerning the Betsy DeVosification of our public schools.
Right.
And you'll need to put this on your lapel. Yes, I'm really glad to have you here, and I apologize for giving you the wrong time.
Not a problem. Is that close enough?
That should be close enough. Could you hear him in the office? Could you hear him in the studio there? Well, why don't we begin with your program, Southpaws. Could we put on the screen the call letters and the times that that's on?
Sure. I gave the gentleman in the hallway those pieces of information. Southpaws itself is syndicated with Pacifica Radio.
Pacifica, excellent.
And we are on, I think, 12 stations now.
Oh, fabulous.
Around the country. And if you'd like to hear the show, simply go to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show, and you will see
you
it.
could hear it live on there too?
No, it is delayed. We broadcast Saturday and usually Saturday afternoon or Friday morning, but we're pretty consistent. We haven't missed a week, and the owner of Southpaws is the owner of Big D Entertainment.
Oh,
He started the show 9 years ago, I think, 8 years ago, and it's never had so many stations with coverage as right now, presently, so we're really happy about that.
12 stations. Are they all Michigan or all nationally?
No, unfortunately, there's none in Michigan. The closest is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We have a plethora of stations out west for whatever reason. Idaho, 2 in California, Richmond, Virginia, Birmingham, Alabama, places you wouldn't think there'd be a voice for progressivism, but there is.
The show is live and takes phone calls.
Not anymore. I was with the show for 2 years when we did take phone calls when we were with PRR Radio here in Grand Rapids. So I hope folks will tune in, and I think we're in trouble in this nation, and truth is maybe the only key that's going to open the door to get us out of it. One of our troubles is we don't realize how much trouble we're really in. So we hope to elucidate some of those problems on the show.
Now, what are some of the topics that you've been dealing with recently?
Well, we talked about the shutdown, obviously. That's so contemporary, the last program. And we felt that there was an opportunity right now presented with the vulnerability of Trump. The numbers indicate most people hold him responsible for the shutdown. It's getting more egregious when we hear of hardship stories, people not having the money to pay their mortgage or their car payment. We see it hit closer to home. We see some protests building up. And now with the LA teachers protest, we think it's an opportune time for some solidarity. Any protest against a shutdown is a protest against Trump. If he doesn't get his wall, I think he falls. I think his wall is a symbol of his xenophobia, a symbol of far-fetched promises that were never realistic. And if it goes down and the Democrats stand firm with a backbone and don't flinch on this, I think it could trip him up. But he's so egregious, we're so inclined as humans to envision how we can get rid of Trump. So I know there's a little wishful thinking mixed into that rationale, but at the same time, I think it's a golden opportunity right now for us to stand against that whole idea.
Now, the strike in LA is similar to the strikes we saw last year in West Virginia and Georgia and other places that had some success. Obviously, teacher salaries have been lagging behind, and class sizes are an absolute scandal, and the tendency is getting worse. Now, in Michigan, we had a Proposal A that was supposed to make the schools equal across the state in terms of funding. That was a failure in terms of fixing the schools. It seems that the schools have got worse and worse with everything they do to fix them. Marka, who was a substitute teacher for a long time, was asking the question of whether DeVos is trying to fix anything at all, or whether all these fixes are meant to fix anything or to make it worse. For instance, universal testing, and then teaching to test. As a public school professional and someone who studied this and someone who has written on it for Grid Magazine, this should be the main topic of our show tonight. We should take advantage of your expertise on the local issue, and we do take phone calls, so our phone number will be on the screen in about 5 minutes, so call in if you can.
Well, I think that Grand Rapids Public Schools was the working lab for Betsy DeVos for years.
I think so too.
I know that personally because I saw her in the hallways. I saw her walking up and down the GRPS hallways. I even saw her sit in on data review meetings. A data review meeting is where the administration and the very closely related principal to the teacher meet and look over numbers and results of tests and just a vast array of things That's a data review, just like the name would imply. And Betsy DeVos would hop into these. I have no idea what criteria they used for her for entrance. So for years, I was aware that she looked upon GRPS as a place of great flexibility. And we know she's an ideologue, and we know the penchant of her ancestors go back generations when they were giving money to private schools 70 years ago in Holland, Michigan. So we know her ideology was to privatize public schools. The DeVosses and the Prince family, previous to her marriage, I'm talking about Betsy, the history is clear and it's empirical. They are against not just public schools, anything public.
Right. Public space, public discourse even.
Exactly. To them it's communal, to them it means sharing, to them it means the antithesis of individual achievement, of which they think they have some special entitlement to claim their own special privilege and space. You know, Steve, I've often said, can you imagine the Thanksgiving dinner? Let's just use our imagination out on the banks of the Lake Michigan, where they built, I think it was a 40-bedroom dwelling, mostly with labor that was not registered and were not legal, but which that's a whole other topic. That house would have many Thanksgiving dinner, and you can imagine on one side of the table Eric Prince and Betsy looking over the gravy bowl, talking about their initiatives. Eric, how is your privatization of the U.S. Army going? We know he's meeting clandestinely with Trump. We know the criminal activity that was proven in court with the mercenary group called Blackwater that he was responsible for forming. He was given, I think it was a $500 million gift, went down and bought property in South Carolina. The water was black, so they called it Blackwater. It was a training ground to train mercenaries, of which went all over the world for profit. And the amount of infiltration into our own economy, the Pentagon can't even tell us. So it would be a good question for Betsy to say, how was your privatization of the U.S. Army going, Eric? And he could respond back over the gravy bowl, well, how was your privatization of the public school system? I think the strike that's going on in California right now, Steve, is a representation of the last real hurrah for a public sector, union especially, left in the United States. This is at the heel of 6 other states that had a summer protest. The thousands of teachers that are out there have the same exact agenda, and if you listen closely, you know, the mainstream media wants you to think it is individual pay, because it's easy to attack that.
Right.
But there, I think you mentioned some of the issues, looking at smaller classes.
Right.
They're looking at funding, state funding to be increased, such as it was asked in Oklahoma and in these other states last summer. They know that the money is being siphoned off to a large percentage of charter schools there in California. So let's bring it back to the question here in Grand Rapids. Her infiltration into Grand Rapids public schools led to, at this point, and some of this is in the writing I have put forth on Good Magazine, a number of purely charter schools in the Grand Rapids district, unknowing to the public, unknowing to the parents. One of them is on the corner of Jefferson and Wealthy.
Wealthy or Jefferson and State? Near
Right
Cherry?
across from Mary Free Bed. It used to be, it's a 3-story school. For years it was a Grand Rapids Public Schools. It's still listed as a Grand Rapids Public Schools.
Of course, right, yeah.
But if you go into the building and ask them, they'll tell you dogmatically, it is a charter school. Charter schools have to be chartered by a university. This school is unique. Guess who chartered this school?
A corporation?
Grand Rapids Public Schools.
The public schools are chartering their own charter school.
They have their own superintendent. Their teachers do not contribute to the retirement fund. And if you dig, and they're very good at obfuscating this, you'll find many buildings just like that. But they're sneaky about it. They're not going to come right out and say, our plan is to align with Betsy DeVos's plan to privatize Grand Rapids Public Schools. That would be absolutely hideous for anybody to hear, so they're very careful. What they do is they call, we're going to have a business/partnership. Grand Rapids Public Schools / partnership. Now, the trouble with that is, it's the entrance, the camel's nose under the tent for the corporations.
Is
It
this-
can be called a public school. It can be a total charter, just school, and still be called a public school. Engler's made sure of that.
So, is this public funding that's paying for a charter school, or is
Okay.
it?
That's where it really gets interesting. You'll notice, for example, the Grand Rapids Public School Museum that just opened up on Jefferson.
Yes,
That's where I think I got my address.
Right, the old public museum.
Right. That started off with a $10 million gift.
Right.
That gift was an award from a business. I think it was XQ or something, that abbreviation. If you went down before it was open, all the windows were plastered. This was a group that was formed by Steve Jobs' widow.
Right.
Steve Jobs' widow had a list of objectives, which, guess what? They're business in their aspect, right? Schools that would conform to some of those ideals and objectives were given money. And GRPS, lo and behold, was one of them.
And this is a national program.
That was a national
that
program.
Mrs. Jobs is running. It's not necessarily associated with Betsy DeVos, but it has some of the same plans.
It's associated in that it's the same genre of neoliberal ideals for education, which is a profit motive.
A profit motive for education, right.
Right. There have been venture capitalists say that public education is the last great market opportunity left. Greater so even than fracking. If you go and you add up the public revenue of tax dollars that go to public education, all of these conservatives look upon public monies as an opportunity for them to get their hands on.
So instead of socializing medicine, we're privatizing public education. Basically, we're going the opposite direction of every civilized country in the world.
Exactly.
Even though we can see from results that countries like Finland, where a teacher is paid the same as a doctor, and they have both socialized medicine and socialized schools, the outcomes are much better.
Much greater.
Yes.
Much better. Exactly.
So,
But just to follow up on the one point, that school that I mentioned, the museum school, if you go 3 blocks from there is another school on the corner of close to Division and Wealthy. That's also a charter school.
Right.
It's called University Prep.
sure, yeah.
That was built entirely with business money. Anytime you see the / partnership, that means business money has gone in. And any business will tell you when they invest money, they expect control, they expect,
Right.
and they do. So they have 2 boards, supposedly the Grand Rapids School Board and their own board
Right.
for the University Prep. And I could go through dozens of buildings where they have, is in Helmholtz's words, this hybrid, this mixture. But the nose of the camel gets in, they take more and more control, they remove some of the dictates that are normal for the public school. One of them is you have to test to get in, so they can control their entrance.
Sure.
Where the public school I grew up with, and Americans are still familiar with, was an open door.
Right,
You lived in that community, you walked in the front door.
right.
Now with these hybrid business / public school buildings, you have to test into many of them.
As I was saying to Mark, part of the purpose seems to be a permanent class structure and the creation of a permanent underclass, a so-called school to prison pipeline. So if you test into these privatized, more elite schools, they train you to work in their industries.
Right.
But if you don't get in, basically you're entering a world of hurt. There's not going to be anything for you but prison or unemployment
Right.
and a constant sense of defeat and powerlessness, which is exactly what they want from a political point of view too.
Right.
Because educated people can make educated decisions, and they don't want that. They only want people educated who are going to be tied to their particular idea of
Exactly.
how a society should exist. And that means
That's a
permanent
core model.
underclass and a permanent overclass.
And you can see that segregation that actually exists in GRPS, in that you have these segregated bodies.
Yeah.
You have some typical public buildings, such as Union, not too many miles from where
Yeah,
we're sitting,
right.
They don't get that same attention and funding. They get the $7,000, but their opportunities, it's not a level playing field. The opportunities for that student compared to the museum school or compared to the city school over in the old Creston building, where they get much more money lavished upon them because they are in collusion with the businesses.
Right.
And that's the template for the whole nation now.
They siphon off the best students from a school that might have 80% poverty rate.
Right.
So, and
Or high minority rates as well.
yes, high minority, high poverty. They say this is a failing school. Now that we've siphoned off the best teachers, now that the classes are too large to even be controlled, much less stick to some sort of lesson plans. And then I say, oh, well, it's a failed school. Where to now?
Yeah. Charter schools have the reputation that it was an improvement.
Yeah.
But historically, that's not where they came from at all.
No.
Historically, a man named Milton Friedman,
Right.
who's the father of trickle-down economics, came up and devised a plan for the southern states who were in a quandary when the federal government said, you must integrate. So Friedman said, no, I've got an idea how to do this. We'll make these charter schools. They can be as white as the one that needed to be integrated.
Right.
And it may cost some money. And so you saw a split in the South. And the numbers show us that where you have charter schools, you have a much higher rate of minority segregation than in the public schools. And so they just reformed, again, what the South had for generations. What we protested, my parents were all for the soldiers going down. You remember the scenes on evening news where they were forcing, not forcing, but I guess the word was forcing, the Southern Bloc to allow minorities into their buildings, which had been for generations. And I can still remember the whites spitting on the students that were being escorted up the steps. Well, the charter schools answer that problem. Started in the South, and we see it now extrapolated all over the country, Steve.
Now, charter schools don't save money, do they?
No, they make money. Just like any business venture, they make money.
They make money for a private sector, but they don't save the public money.
Well, not at all, no. They reap that money and get monies on top of that money.
Right. So it's another form of corporate welfare, really.
Yeah, you could say that. See, you have to understand that the overthrow of the public school institution is first to break it. And how are you going to break the institution that's lasted this long?
Siphon the money off.
Siphon the money off. I mean, we know venture capitalists. I remember when Romney was running, they had this list of places where they drain the money, and then they come in and they buy it and they make money on the. So that's not a tactic that's unfamiliar. Shouldn't be a tactic. And to think they would apply it to public schools makes total sense.
It's hard to even call it capitalism. You're not really creating anything. You're just sucking money out of the public sector, sort of a vampire capitalism.
Right. Right. But you know, for example, the Bushes, they took public money to improve their private stadiums, their football stadiums.
Yeah.
And that equation, people should recognize that. That's the dream of conservative investors. Use public money for private profit.
Right.
The public takes the gamble and the chance. The private reaps the profit.
That was part of Trump's development strategies in Manhattan.
Yes.
It's the huge tax breaks. The states compete to give companies the hugest tax breaks. Wisconsin basically gave Foxconn Lake Michigan.
Yeah, you know, the playbook, I used to be a coach, and there are certain plays that in athletics have worked for centuries. The conversion of public sector to private sector reaps huge profits for a minority of people. Stop and use common sense, listeners. What profit was used, say, even as a public library is down here, what was evenly distributed for all of the workers for the gain of many has been turned upside down, where the gain of a few are the benefactors. And that's the conversion of the commune or the public space and the public institutions to private. They have a penchant. They are totally, completely opposed to anything public. Post office,
But
Army.
It's really socialism for the rich, though, because they're too big to fail. It's capitalism. How did Martin Luther King put it? And Martin Luther King Day is coming up. This is a live cable cast, GRTV, CTV. Could we put our phone number up there? We are taking phone calls. So we're talking about the socialization of risks and penalties and pollution and the privatization of profit, the systematic sucking of private money or public money into private pockets,
Exactly.
even as taxes for the wealthy. We can't do calls tonight. Okay. So anyway, talking about Betsy DeVos, talking about the public schools and how Grand Rapids was a playground and a laboratory for the kind of privatization that Betsy DeVos is bringing to the whole country now, the kind of policies that are repressive to minorities and the poor and that create a permanent class system in the United States, a permanent underclass bound for prison and a permanent upper class bound for government and boardrooms. So let's go on with this. I'm sorry that we can't take calls.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
This is public access television. We've been here 20 years, and the cable company has fought us every step of the way. I guess they would prefer have people watching TV than making TV, but I ask the viewers to consider making your own television. Get creative, get involved.
Comments can come in on Facebook. We're live on Facebook.
We're live on Facebook. If you have a question or a comment, you can post it to Facebook, and we'll read it on the air. How about that?
You know, some of the history again of GRPS specifically. You told me that your engineer actually had some substitute teaching experience.
Yes.
That's a prime example of the insidious process of privatization.
Right.
For years, I taught for a while when I was younger and as a substitute teacher, and that went directly into a pension. That was a state pension plan. You could actually build 10 years of tenure as a teacher and draw retirement just as a substitute.
Wow.
With the DeVos influence, a person left the confines of Franklin Street Administration Building, this was maybe 15 years ago, drove to a private insurance company. This is in some of the writing you mentioned in Grid Magazine.
Yeah.
One that later came under scrutiny and was forced to close down for fraudulent sale of insurance. Talked to the owner and started the very first private substitute institution in West Michigan. Okay, now what the substitute teachers did were gathered into cafeterias across GRPS and said, you no longer, okay, will be working and putting your money in to a pension fund that you may someday draw from. Now it's been, what's the term? It's been privatized.
You're right. It's like a temp service for working in a factory.
Exactly. The amount of pay dropped exponentially. The amount of service dropped, primarily because before that local secretary at the school had a relationship with the substitute. She knew we had a special need in this room. This substitute fits that perfectly.
Right.
Those kinds of nuances were never looked at by the privatized sector.
Right.
That's just one example. I can continue. The bus service, same exact
Yep.
thing. The bus drivers at GRPS said, we will abdicate, we'll give up a certain amount of our benefits to remain as the drivers of these public buses. It was ignored. The system was privatized. There was immediate drop in service. You asked if any money was saved. The cost went up. The actual money to those, I think it's Dean Transportation,
Yeah, Dean Transportation.
was bigger than it had been. There was a warehouse down on Cedar Street for GRPS for years. The school, the public school, had workers that would purchase goods, everything from chalk to soap to floor cleaners. They would buy them at the best possible prices in large volumes, and they distributed them. It was part of the GR public schools. That's all been privatized now. There were thousands of items in that building, Steve. They're all gone now. Now they have private people handle each and every, and there's all kinds of segments. Concession stands. private, people say, oh, GRPS isn't privatized. They're not aware.
Yeah.
It's like termites. It's slowly being devoured from
Right.
public to private.
Right. In bits and pieces, like a private prison. Originally, oh, we're just contracting the laundry, or we're just contracting the human resources. And next thing you know, Whack and Hut owns the whole prison.
Exactly.
And they've turned it into a slave camp.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, we have a proliferation right now of these detention centers across the United States. It's $1 billion business.
It is.
Sprouted right up. It's a private endeavor. The private prison industry is a major factor out there now, and everything is being privatized. People need to realize Reagan had two weapons: privatization and deregulation. Mm-hmm. And they keep working those plays like a good football play over and over and over.
They're driving it down the field there.
They are.
They privatized the prisons. Now they're privatizing schools. Next, they'll be privatizing the post office.
Right.
And
Yeah,
then,
I mean, they purposely put a levy on, well, they insisted, I think it was legally insisted, they had to assign so much money, millions of dollars, for retirement.
Right.
That goes 75 years in the future.
yeah, nobody else does that.
So they'll come up with ingenious ways to break the back of that public institution.
And then when they do, they'll probably steal the pension. That seems to be part of the thing.
Exactly.
When they finally break an institution, then they grab the pensions of the people who were in it before. As much as what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Mm-hmm. Many people lost their pensions, but huge fortunes were created suddenly by grabbing everything that was hanging loose and lying on the ground. And I suppose if our system were to collapse, a similar event would take place. Mm-hmm. But they're doing it in slow motion so that people hardly even notice it. All they notice is that it gets harder and harder every year.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's like the frog that's being boiled very slowly. The temperature of the water just slowly goes up. It doesn't really notice it. You mentioned the, well, let's go to the private school substitute teacher reality. All of the monies that substitute teachers had put into the system for retirement that was in Lansing, under 10 years, went into the investment company that was headed by the man there in Caledonia, by the way.
Wow.
It started. So you talked about taking public money. They actually privatized it into a 401k.
Yeah.
And 401k took a real beating, as we know. And many of those, not many, all those substitutes saw all of that pension money just evaporate.
Where'd it go? Somebody got it.
No, I'm a firm believer that the answer right now is education. I'm not saying that because I'm just a former teacher. I don't think people realize the transformation that's taking place. It's interesting, that's the superintendent's moniker for what's going on in Grand Rapids Public Schools. No matter what takes place. For example, they just announced building a, I don't know how many $1 million school south of town, down on Granville Avenue. Okay, well that, she says, is a transformation plan. The transformation plan is we give up buildings to charter schools for $1, and then we build brand new ones with business money. That's a transformation plan.
Yeah.
Transformation is code for public to private. And who cooked up the term transformation plan? It wasn't the superintendent. She'd like you to think she got that in her education and milieu and background. She was a secretary before she became superintendent of Grand Rapids Public Schools.
Holy
she had no
moly.
teaching experience, not a single day. The DeVosses hired a business company called Cambridge. Came to Grand Rapids, observed, went into my classroom, went into many classrooms, looked at the buildings, took measurements, came up with some recommendations. They came up with the term transformation plan. That firm was hired by the DeVosses. The vice president of that firm was one of the largest leaders or owners of a charter school.
Wow.
Their proclivity is to privatize. So that transformation plan is that we can't say we're going to transform from public to private. We'll say everything we do is called transformation plan. It's all good. But
Well,
the
for
bottom
this-
line, it's privatization.
If this is happening, certainly the school board must be in the pocket of
Good point.
the DeVosses. And Apparently, voting hasn't done anything about it. People are afraid to run against the local machine.
Local machine.
Who else is a part of this local machine? It looks like Rockford Construction is made out like bandits with all the transformation of our public schools into condominiums or into charter schools. So there's a school up here on Coit Street that was turned into condominiums a few years ago.
Exactly. Well, of course, the old Union High School was turned into apartments. Yeah, I think I saw it quoted in MLive. I don't know how many buildings have closed in the last 20 years. Beautiful Grand Rapids buildings. And let's go to Creston High School, a community school, Generations of Pride, the polar bears, right?
Yeah.
We were told, I was in the board meeting, there just weren't enough people there. They didn't have enough enrollment. So they closed that public school down, forced those students to go to Central High School. Imagine being in the neighborhood of Creston, and now your new address for the next public school was then Central.
Wow.
They make a magnet school. The enrollment went up 50 people. So that whole baloney about the enrollment being a problem was bogus. They have done in the middle of this school, with the help of a complicit board and a complicit media, a marvelous job of transforming a public system.
Now, with these schools being more segregated, more white, more affluent, are they also drawing away from the traditional enrollment of the Catholic schools? The Catholic schools feeling a pinch from this, or they have too many problems of their own to try to fight against it? It seems like the Catholic schools would like the public schools to be the way they were, in which case they can remain one of the premium private destinations for
That's a
people
good
who just
question.
don't want to go to school with
Right.
too many poor black people.
Now, I was a teacher that was affiliated with the Catholic schools. Grand Rapids Public Schools used to actually give teachers to the Catholic schools. I taught at Catholic Central and Catholic Central, or West Catholic. So that's a good point. They may feel that. The thing that we have to understand is that we have a Secretary of Ed who never attended a public school. We have a superintendent who that Secretary of Ed asked to come to Washington to support her in her bid for the Secretary of Ed job. How many other superintendents came from the United States? None. There was one. Her cost to go to Washington and her entourage was picked up completely by a foundation from the DeVos's. There was no other superintendent. Betsy DeVos and Teresa Neal were tight. It's been indicated that Betsy DeVos personally gave $67,000 to Teresa Neal when she was appointed superintendent to coach her. I mean, imagine you get a job somewhere and some benevolent sideline observer comes and says, I'll give you $67,000 to help you in your career. It's a $67,000 gift from the DeVos's to Teresa Neal. So me and some other teachers said, well, what kind of influence will that have on the policy? Because when you get business money, when you get that kind of intrusion, they want something.
Sure. They want to suck more of the public money out of the institution. So
I've got an answer.
It's like when Exxon gives $1 million in contributions, half each to both sides in a congressional race. They're going to get more out of it no matter who wins.
Right.
It's because it's an investment, because there's vampire capitalism. They have to get in the door and then they start sucking.
Yeah.
They
I've
suck.
heard of a boardroom that takes a decision for investment that doesn't reap a profit someplace.
Right.
And they realized that a $67,000 gift to the new superintendent would buy influence.
And Neal, you say, was a secretary before she became a superintendent.
That's it.
And what kind of secretary was she?
She was the secretary for Bletke for years there at Franklin Street.
I see. So she was the secretary to the superintendent.
Secretary to, and then she was on a segment of the administration after that. She wasn't the secretary when she was appointed as the superintendent. Interestingly enough, Before Teresa Neal, we had another superintendent who the indication would show that he was picked by the power structure here in Grand Rapids as well. There was a superintendent from a Canadian school who was indeed an honorable and had a great legacy of educational accomplishment that was decided upon to be the superintendent. Suddenly a phone call came in that no, they didn't want that person. And they came up with the name of Bernard Taylor. Bernard Taylor was from Kansas. Bernard Taylor was fired. Imagine Grand Rapids Public Schools hiring the superintendent of Kansas City, who was fired and was told he could not step on the campus.
What'd he do?
He refused to get rid of a student who took a knife and cut a student's throat in a lunch line. How do I know this? It's in the Kansas City Star. How the Grand Rapids Press didn't vet this candidate named Bernard Taylor is a great mystery. But I think a few years after his appointment, the school district got rid of him, and he insisted on taking a $500,000 stipend with him. It was a complete egregious history of superintendents. After that, you'd have thought they would have gone into a nationwide search and done the very best job to get a person with an educational background. But what did GRPS do? They take a person intrinsically who never taught a minute in her life. Talk about Betsy not going into a public classroom or any of her children. After that fiasco with Bernard Taylor, they go right back into the district, into their own system, and get a person who's woefully unqualified.
Well, willing to do what she's told.
But willing to do what she was told.
Like the Board of Education themselves. Is there no one on the Board of Education trying to stand up to the DeVosses?
Steve, that's a good question. I'll extend that to West Michigan. I'll extend that to the media here in Grand Rapids. I'll extend that from the Great Lakes to Detroit. Who is able to stand up to the DeVosses? We know that in the legislature, that when Republicans were voting on an issue, the DeVosses had a room, and Lisa Lyons, I think, is her father. His last name is Posthumous.
Yeah.
If they weren't willing to line up with the vote under the objectives that the DeVosses wanted, they found themselves taken into this room. And they quickly realized, we either vote in line with what they want, or we'll be primaried. How can you fight a billionaire and win the election? And so you have a kingship. You have a kingship, and the media, the school districts, as we looked at the legislatures, they know where their bread is buttered. The Grand Rapids Board knows where its bread is buttered. They know it's pretty much suicide. I'm not going to go get the city commissioner job after I serve my 4 years here on the board. I'm not going to go get the Kent County commissioner's job if I don't line up with the objectives of the DeVosses.
So this is an oligarchy. We have the forms of democracy, but the actual decisions are being made by the top tiers of the 1% of the 1%.
That's exactly right.
And anybody who doesn't like it is out of a job.
Yep. Yeah, it's essentially that simple.
So the only solution probably is a massive direction of energy. I mean, we still have the forms of democracy. Theoretically, it's still possible to have a school board, for instance, that would represent the families of students and the community at large.
That's a great idea.
It could happen. I mean, it's not impossible, theoretically.
Right.
So what's standing in the way? Distraction, apathy, confusion, ideological blinders.
Why is there $50,000, $60,000 every day of the week, and particularly in the weekend, in France, of people? These aren't anarchists. They would want you to think they're anarchists. These are mothers and fathers with families who realize the direction of an oligarchy there in France. And they're taking appropriate action. They are in the streets. They are committing acts of disobedience. I don't support physical damage of property, but they are protesting, and they've already seen some results. Where are we at? We see Trump talking about raising the military budget. You know, I don't know how many, and the Democrats line up right behind that
Yeah.
and vote with their hands up. And then a little while later, we hear this tax break to the millionaires. They all lined up on both sides of the aisle and supported that. What do we need to bring the yellow vest started over, what was it, a gas tax?
Yes, a gas tax. Rural people felt that it wasn't fair since, you know, they needed to drive their cars and
We have incidents coming out of our authoritarian government here that are hundreds times worse. For example, the tax break to the billionaires, the tax break to the corporations that will come out of our skin, the middle class. Where are yellow vests?
well, it seems that a fair fraction of even the poorest Americans are willing to roll over and play dead for the richest Americans. I think it's a different feeling than in France. The French, at least since the revolution, their instinct has always been, we got to keep these powerful people in line or we'll be right back where we started. Whereas in America, a lot of poor people still think, one day I could be Donald Trump if my dad would just leave me $250 million.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is exactly. Perhaps there's too much division along identity politics line. It's like poor white people didn't want to support single payer when Truman wanted it because reactionaries and demagogues are going, the black people will get it too, and it's like, well, if the black people are going to get it, I'm not for it. I mean, white racism has really kept poor people under the thumbs of the rich. That's one of the things going on. So
I remember Bernie using, what was it, Finland or Sweden as an example for successful socialism. And the American public recoiled. It was like it was a dirty word, the word socialism.
Amongst older people.
Countries. What's that?
Amongst older people, young people don't seem to mind it.
No, and that's encouraging. It really is. You know, one time there were 2,000 socialistic newspapers in the United States.
Yeah, before World War I, and then the so-called progressive Wilson squelched them all under the Espionage Acts of World War I. That was a power grab.
But I can see why Bernie would look over there for inspiration. We just saw, was it Iceland? Voted that there could be no American evangelists land on Iceland soil. We're talking about a progressive idea. And before that, the female prime minister had a law passed that every woman had to get the same exact wage as her male counterpart.
Right.
And it goes on and on. So
and they jailed their bankers after the world collapse.
Exactly.
But of course, then right-wingers will come back and say, well, Japan, Denmark, Iceland, those are ethnically homogenous societies. So of course they could have socialism because they don't have the same divisions. Yeah. And there may be something to that. But those divisions have to be cultivated. You know, you need someone like Trump pointing his finger at people who are more powerless than you are, going, and it's his fault that you're having trouble. At the same time, he sucks the money out of the public purse.
See, they have the best minds that come out of the universities, the Yales and the Harvards and the Stanfords, on how to rationalize greed. They'll look like mad. They'll land on an Ayn Rand and say, here's a person who espouses greed. Somehow makes it palatable. And they'll push her philosophy, you know, as I was teaching at Union High School, and we got an offer through the mail. Free books from Ayn Rand, all the free books you want. We're cash strapped. We can't afford to buy To Kill a Mockingbird. We can't get the book Black Like Me, too expensive. But we can get the free books from the corporate coffers. They have the money. And the conservatives have these huge think tanks in Washington, where hundreds of people spend their days in deciding what's the best propaganda to make people fall for, of all things, neoliberalism. And neoliberalism isn't liberalism. Neoliberalism means give the businesses what they want. Cut their taxes, and the money will fall down on them. It's idiotic. It would take a lot of persuasion to get anybody to believe it, but they got people to believe it. They've convinced people, Reagan convinced people, if you give the businesses breaks and you tell them you don't have to worry about the smoke coming out of your stack any longer, don't worry about the regulations, we're going to own the EPA, you'll make more money, and that money's going to rain across the United States. It's so far-fetched, it took a lot of spin masters to push it down our throat, but they succeeded.
Well, some of those spin masters were religious spin masters. Evangelicals especially promoted a gospel of prosperity. You've heard of the family, recently exposed as being infiltrated by Russian intelligence, too.
Right. Yep.
Their idea is Jesus doesn't care about poor people. Jesus is strong, he wants you to be strong, and that means getting money and keeping it for yourself. And I don't know how they justify that, but they're, as with any religion, there are people willing to believe something that's absurd if they're getting something out of it.
Right, exactly.
Some sort of justification.
Right, and remember,
what was
primarily, I don't want to attack religions, but primarily, the predominant religion, Christianity, believes that independent thinking is a contradiction to faith. Lean not on your own understanding, right? The old gospel, trust and obey. There's no other way. So if my leader says it makes a lot of sense to give the corporations everything they want, my job is to trust and obey.
Because Trump's a godly man.
Right. I see pictures of Jesus Mirage behind Trump at the desk there in the White House, and I hear Franklin Graham say that, or who was it, Robertson, some of those yo-yos, they're not going to go to Iceland, you know, but saying things like, if you disobey Trump, you're disobeying God.
Right. If you vote against Trump, you'll go to hell. I heard that one, too.
Yeah.
Well, there's the things you hear from these people. One guy's selling slips of paper that you can write your sins on, and then you burn them, and then your sins are gone.
It's a good
I mean, it's not the worst thing they do, but it's symptomatic of the sort of
flim-flam.
it's a flim-flam. It's a con job, and they found the messiah of con men in Donald Trump.
Right. the
And he
authoritarian
promoted Betsy DeVos because she gave him money, and he'll do anything that'll give him money.
figure. Right. That authoritarian figure that's going to save us all.
Yeah.
From John Wayne to Trump. He's the guy that's able to make money no matter what. Let's face it, Americans kind of got what they really envy. They got a guy who could even beat taxes. He bragged about how he beat the tax system, didn't he?
Yeah, well, we haven't seen the tax returns yet.
And had all these beautiful women on his arm. And how is he any different than lifestyles of the rich and famous? That's what people, that's our ideal. The idea of a communal person that works with other people, it's laughable.
Well, he did say that he's been making all this money for himself. Now he's going to make money for everybody.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it didn't work out that way.
It never does. Any more than that trickle-down theory landed in our pockets, Steve. I would ask people, I don't know how much time is left, it's kind of hard to see
5
with
minutes.
the lights, to go if you're interested in some of the writings that we mentioned here on the grid. It's called Betsy DeVos and the Covert Privatization of Grand Rapids Public Schools. They can go to the internet and just type that in, and they'll get the, it's a 5-piece article. There's still one piece left. The last piece points out the fact that there's still no heat in Union High School,
Right.
while we're building new high schools over here with business money. After 2 years, it's been that way. That's the last segment, and there'll be a final one, and then that will be finished.
Are we able to put that on the screen where people can go to see that? That's GRIID is the name of the.
2 I's, yes.
Yes.
GRIID.
Is the name of the publication, and the name of the series of articles
So
is
the articles are Betsy DeVos
Betsy DeVos.
and the Covert Privatization of Grand Rapids Public Schools. I think it's GRPS on the title.
Right.
And we
And,
certainly urge people locally to listen to the softballs. We've
Yeah.
talked a lot about the school districts, a lot of local issues.
And yet that plays around the country and not here, except
Yeah,
on
but
Facebook.
we're getting closer. We have a station down by St. Joseph that we think is going to syndicate soon. And so there will be, and hopefully right here in Grand Rapids, we'll
Yeah.
in on that.
Mark gave me a note. It says DeVos Senior House on Lake Michigan built a gate with armed guards to cut off access to the road to a public park on Macatawa Point on Lake Michigan. Yeah, I remember that. I used to live not far from there. Yeah, they want to privatize the beach shore too. Basically, they want everything good for themselves and scraps for everybody else.
Yeah, the idea of privatization in and of itself means the public loses control over these parts of their life, these
Right.
integral parts of their life.
Right.
In its simplest form, you're advocating your involvement with the government, with these institutions that will make you a slave if you lose that. The utilities used to be public, for crying out loud. Look
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah.
Has amounted to today. So I really enjoyed the time here, Steve. I don't know how many minutes are left. And,
We've got 2 minutes to
minutes.
go.
okay.
This has been Oh Say Can You See? We're discussing the privatization of the public schools, the effects of Betsy DeVos's plans on Grand Rapids and now on the nation. We come here every 2 weeks. It's a live program, 7 o'clock on Wednesdays, 1st, 3rd, and 5th Wednesdays of the month. CTV stands for Society for Economic Equality. What's it now, 22 years we've been doing this? 1995.
It's a great service to the community.
And we encourage you too to get involved with local public access television. Yep, on YouTube, CTV Society, all lowercase. On Facebook, you can listen to Southpaws, or you can move out west and pick it up on the radio.
Red River, New Mexico.
Jack Prince has been my guest today, co-host of Southpaws, author of articles on Betsy DeVos, and your last name is Prince. I should have asked you when we began. Are you related to Betsy and Eric?
I'm the English version, and my family has never had much money at all. They're Canadians, and no relation to the Dutch Prince family here.
Or the Machiavellian princes?
No, no. My name is actually Prince Albert, like the chewing tobacco. So that's my own thing. Used to be my sign, travel, but no relation to the dynasty.
I see, I didn't know. No relation to